Minutes, all to yourself.
Thank you. So I'm glad to speak for Labour in support of this motion and to commend Deputy Whitmore and her colleagues for bringing it forward. Sorry, old habits die hard from the Seanad. I'm glad to have the opportunity that you've given us to debate this important and pressing issue of data centres in a measured, thoughtful and rational way. And I do think the wording of your motion is really carefully worded. It simply calls for a pause on the development of data centres, and it sets out, I think, very clearly and persuasively the reasons for doing so. When I took up the brief for Labour on climate very recently and started looking into the question of data centres, I suppose what surprised me most, Minister, was the absence of a updated national plan or government strategy on data centres. And to me this is particularly surprising given the projections of massively increased demand arising from data centres, which others have spoken about, which we've seen from AirGrid's analysis, which shows that demand from data centres could account for 27% of all demand in Ireland by 2029. And again, others have spoken about that. I mean, that's a very staggering figure. But given that data centre demand is predictable, that we can project the demand, that demand is steady, that it seems then even more surprising to me that the most up-to-date government statement on the role of data centres is that from June 2018. And I think what we really need to see is a clarity of approach from government at a national level as to how the demand for energy from data centres will be managed. I think, again, listening carefully to what the proposers have said, they've said they're not opposed to data centres, and I think that's, again, a sensible point to make. That ship has sailed, we might say. We're all utterly reliant on data centres, on connectivity, on global connectivity. We accept also, I think all of us, how crucial the tech sector is for Ireland. In Dublin Bay South, my own constituency and yours, Minister, I think we're all very conscious of the enormous contribution the tech sector has made. And I think, again, taking a measured and rational approach, I would agree with you, Minister. Yes, we do need a plan-led, regionally balanced approach. I do think that policy and regulation are required to enable the transition to a zero-carbon electricity system that is required. But what is lacking currently from government, both in your speech, Minister, and indeed in the government amendment or counter-motion, what's lacking is that present clarity. What's lacking is a sense of how the growth of data centres is to be managed over the short and medium term. You mentioned in your speech the publication of plans in the next month, but in the meantime, we don't know. And I'm looking at the wording of the government counter-motion. The government will set out a suite of actions. The government statement on role of data centres will ensure a role and alignment with electricity emission reductions. But I think what we need to know is, well, how is this to be managed? And we need to know that now, and that's really what this motion is saying. It's calling for a pause as an interim measure in further development until the sort of crucial assessments that we need into the environmental impact in particular, and into indeed the economic and energy impact has been carried out. And I think that sort of risk analysis seems to me a sensible and measured approach. And I think there are two reasons why we do need to support this motion and why we will be voting for it. This motion recognises, first, the demand on energy, and as we've said, this projected increased demand on energy as a result of development of data centres. And secondly, the motion recognises the climate emergency within which we are all struggling with these issues. So in terms of the demand on energy, others have pointed out, we have 70 operational data centres in Ireland. Most are concentrated around Dublin, so it's the largest data centre hub in Europe. That's not something to be dismayed about, again, because if they aren't here, they will be elsewhere, and the climate emergency is a global one. So again, we have to bear that in mind when we're speaking about data centres. And as the Minister said, many of the multinationals have stated their commitment to transitioning to zero carbon power, to carbon emission neutrality, and that's all, again, welcome. But we know, and particularly we know, looking at what AirGrid are saying today, we know that even where the energy that fuels data centres comes from renewable sources, and predominantly from, and as we hope it will, predominantly from renewable sources. Nonetheless, it will still add, the demand still adds pressure to the grid, and we are still so reliant on non-renewable sources that demand becomes unsustainable without clear policy interventions, clear and urgent action to be taken by government. And that's what we are, it's the absence of an indication from government as to what that intervention will be, I think, that this motion speaks to so importantly. And it's important to note also that, as I've said, the contribution of data, the demand will be steady. We can project what the demand will be from data centres into the future. But that's all the more reason to have that coherent national strategy in place. And it's not just about energy and energy demand. It's also, of course, about the demand on our water supply, because we know that most data centres use huge amounts of water to cool the servers. In terms of the climate emergency, and again, I know that all present are very conscious of this. We are at a crucial juncture in the movement, in the international movement, to fight climate change. We are conscious of the IPCC report last month, and we know tomorrow here in the Dáil we'll be debating the upcoming Climate Action Plan in anticipation of the COP26 conference in Glasgow at the end of October. We also know the huge mobilisation of young people in particular. We saw many of them last week outside Leinster House last Friday, but just so many who are so anxious to see us taking urgent action to address climate change. And because of this, and because the government's own commitments commit us to reducing our emissions by a 51% target by 2030, with net zero carbon emission target for 2050, and that commitment to reaching 70% renewable electricity by 2030, we know with all of this that this is simply not compatible with the projected increased demand in data centres unless we see from government a radical and urgent intervention and a clear and coherent plan as to how this demand is going to be met, how it's going to be met while enabling us, while aligning us with those ambitious but vital targets on climate emission reduction. So I think, just Minister, to conclude, as I've said, this motion simply calls for a pause. It's an interim measure, and it's an essential interim measure to ensure that we will be able to meet climate targets while and develop a sustainable policy on placing of data centres. It's crucial that we do this. We owe it to future generations and to our own young people who are out protesting every week in order to do this. What we're lacking currently from government is a clear strategy in the present tense as to how this will be managed into the future, and that's why we're proud to support this motion for Labour.
Thank you, Deputy.